The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Aaliyah Miller heard a man stand up for the first time in 6 months and say her name like it was a warning and a prayer at the same time. Aaliyah. That was all he said. One word. But the way Carlos Vega said it made every guard in that marble hallway freeze where they stood. Because Carlos Vega had not stood on his own 2 legs since the night a bullet tore through his spine on a rooftop in Cartagena. The doctor said he would never walk again. His own family had already started fighting over his empire, like vultures circling a body that was still breathing. And now, he was standing, gripping the back of a chair with white knuckles, sweat running down his jaw, legs shaking like a newborn animal's. And he was looking past his uncle, past his sister, past the men with guns lowered and shot, straight at the nurse in the doorway with blood on her hands that was not her own. "Get away from her," he said, and his voice cracked the air like a whip, "or I will kill every single one of you in this room." Nobody moved, because nobody in that house had ever heard Carlos Vega raise his voice for anyone. Not once, not even for his own mother's funeral. But that moment, that terrifying, impossible moment, did not start there. It started 3 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday, in a hospital break room that smelled like burnt coffee, when Aaliyah Miller almost said no to the job that would change her life forever. Aaliyah had been a nurse for 8 years. She had seen men die with their eyes open and babies born screaming into fluorescent light, and she thought there was nothing left in this profession that could surprise her. She was wrong, but she did not know that yet. She was 29 years old. With copper red hair she kept twisted up in a claw clip because loose hair got in the way of real work, and curves she had stopped apologizing for around the time she turned 25 and realized apologizing had never once paid a bill. She had a laugh that came from her stomach, not her throat, and eyes that missed nothing, not a flinch, not a lie, not a man sizing her up like she was a problem to be solved instead of a person. She had raised her younger brother Tyler alone since she was 22, after their mother died of a heart that had simply given out from working too many double shifts, and their father had already been gone for a decade before that, gone in the way fathers go when the bar becomes more interesting than the family. Tyler was 19 now, smart in a way that scared her, the kind of smart that could either build something beautiful or burn everything down depending on which door life opened for him first. He was 2 semesters into community college and 1 missed payment away from losing his spot. That was the truth sitting behind Aaliyah's eyes the day her supervisor, Diane, pulled her into the break room with a folder pressed flat against her chest like it was something she did not want anyone else to see. "There's a private position," Diane said. "High pay, higher than anything you'd see on a hospital floor. 6 figures for what could be a few months of work." Aaliyah laughed, sharp and sharp. "What's the catch?" "The catch is you don't ask questions. You sign an NDA before you even see the client's face. You don't post about it, you don't talk about it, you don't tell your brother, your friends, your priest, nobody. The family is private, very private." "Diane, what kind of family needs a nurse and a vow of silence?" Diane's mouth pressed into a thin line, and for the first time in the 9 years Aaliyah had known her, she looked afraid. "The kind of family you don't say no to," Diane said. "But also, and I need you to hear this part, the kind of money that pays off a mortgage in 1 year, the kind that pays for a little brother's whole degree in cash." Aaliyah's stomach turned over once, hard, at the mention of Tyler. Diane knew exactly which string to pull, and they both knew it. "Who's the patient?" "A man. Spinal injury. Paralysis. Possibly permanent, possibly not. The doctors don't agree. Wealthy. Foreign. That's genuinely all I know, Aaliyah, and I've worked this agency for 11 years. Aaliyah sat with that answer a long time, longer than she meant to, staring at the folder Diane still hadn't opened. "Send me the address," she said finally. "I'll go look. That's all I'm promising." She did not know, walking out of that break room with her scrubs still smelling like antiseptic, that she had just agreed to walk into the middle of a war. The estate sat behind 2 miles of private road on the Florida Gulf Coast, hidden behind sea grape trees and a wall high enough to swallow the sound of the ocean on the other side. Aaliyah's old Honda felt like an insult rolling up the gravel drive past black SUVs parked in careful military rows. A man built like a refrigerator patted her down at the gate without a hint of apology in his face. Another one took her phone, her bag, ran a wand over her body that beeped once near her belt buckle and made her heart stop until he grunted and waved her through. "Name," he said. "Aaliyah Miller. I'm the nurse. Agency sent me." "You're late." "I'm 3 minutes early." The man, young, maybe 25, with a scar cutting through one eyebrow, almost smiled. Almost. "Nobody's ever early for this house, princess. Come on." She hated the word princess. She said nothing because something in her gut told her this was not the place to fight small battles. She would need her fight for something bigger, though she didn't know it yet. Inside, the house was colder than the Florida air outside, all marble and shadow, portraits of stern-faced men lining a hallway that seemed to stretch longer the further she walked. And at the end of it, a set of double doors, guarded by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a year. "Mateo," the young guard said. "Nurse is here." Mateo turned.
He was maybe 40, with gray threading through his temples and eyes that had clearly watched too much to ever be surprised again. He looked Aaliyah over the way you would inspect a used car, top to bottom, checking for damage. "You scare easy?" Mateo asked. "I've had a man bleed out on my hands while his wife screamed at me that I wasn't trying hard enough. I don't scare easy." Something shifted behind Mateo's eyes. Respect, maybe, or pity. She would spend weeks trying to tell the difference. "Good," he said. "You'll need that. He's already gone through 4 nurses. One quit after 2 days, one he fired after 2 hours. Mateo paused at the door, hand on the brass handle. "Whatever he says to you in there, don't take it personal, and don't cry in front of him. He hates that more than anything." "I don't cry in front of patients," Aaliyah said. "I cry in my car." For the first time, Mateo actually smiled. Then he opened the door, and Aaliyah Miller walked into the room that would become the center of her entire life, and she had absolutely no idea. The room was dark, curtains pulled tight against the Gulf sun, and it took her eyes a moment to adjust to the shape of a man sitting in a wheelchair by the far window, a sliver of light cutting across his jaw like a blade. He was younger than she expected. Early 30s, maybe. Black hair pushed back like he had run his hands through them too many times, a jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and a stillness to him that reminded her of something coiled, something waiting. He wore a white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and even sitting in a wheelchair, even with a blanket draped uselessly over legs that no longer obeyed him, he radiated the kind of power that made the air in the room feel thinner. He did not look at her right away. He was looking at the ocean through a 2-inch gap in the curtain, like it was the only thing in the world worth his attention. "The 4 nurses came before you," he said, in a voice low and accented, each word placed like a chess piece. "Do you know why the others left?" "I heard you fired one of them. I fired her because she talked to me like I was a child. The other 3 left on their own." He finally turned his head, and his eyes, dark, almost black, ringed with exhaustion he refused to let touch the rest of his face, locked onto hers. "Should I be afraid of you?" Aaliyah asked, setting her bag down without breaking eye contact. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, quickly buried. "Everyone is afraid of me." I asked if I should be, not if everyone is. The silence that followed was long enough that Aaliyah heard the ocean through the window, waves folding over themselves again and again. Carlos Vega studied her the way a man studies a puzzle he does not expect to solve quickly. "What is your name?" "Aaliyah Miller." "Aaliyah Miller." He said it slowly, testing the shape of it in his mouth like he was deciding whether to keep it. "You are not what I expected the agency to send."
What did you expect? Someone smaller, someone who would apologize for existing in my presence. His eyes moved over her, not unkindly, but with the bluntness that most men try to hide, and he clearly did not bother to. "You do not look like a woman who apologizes for much." Aaliyah felt heat rise in her chest, half anger, half something she refused to name. "I'm here to check your vitals, review your chart, and figure out a therapy plan for your legs. I'm not here to be looked at." "I look at everything in my house," Carlos said, and there was no apology in it at all. "It is how I stay alive." She crossed the room anyway, pulled a rolling stool beside his wheelchair, and reached for the blood pressure cuff in her bag, like his words hadn't landed somewhere under her ribs. "Then look at your chart while I take your blood pressure, Mr. Vega. That's a lot less trouble for both of us." For a long moment he didn't move. Then, slow and deliberate, he extended his arm toward her, and Aaliyah would swear later that the corner of his mouth had almost curved upward. "You may call me Carlos," he said. "The last nurse who called me Mr. Vega is the one I fired." Aaliyah wrapped the cuff around his arm, her fingers brushing skin that was warmer than she expected for a man who kept his whole world so cold. She did not know yet that this was the exact moment Carlos Vega decided she would not be nurse number 5 who quit. She had no idea he had already decided she would not be allowed to leave at all. The first 2 weeks were a war fought in silence. Carlos answered her questions in clipped sentences. He refused half his physical therapy exercises, calling them a waste of time for a body the doctors had already given up on. He watched her with an intensity that made her hands shake sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, except he was always looking. She learned quickly that Carlos Vega noticed everything: the chip in her nail polish, the exhaustion under her eyes on the mornings after Tyler called her at 2 a.m. panicking about a paper due, the way her jaw tightened whenever Mateo mentioned the man they called the Colonel, a name nobody would explain to her. She learned things about the house in pieces: that the woman who sometimes swept through the halls like a hurricane, dark-haired and sharp-tongued, was Isabella, Carlos's younger sister, 26, who looked at Aaliyah like she was a stray animal that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. That the older man with silver hair and a smile that never once reached his eyes was Rafael, Carlos's uncle, his father's younger brother, who called Carlos mijo in a voice stripped with something that was not quite affection. And she learned, though nobody said it outright, that 6 months ago a man named Esteban Vega, Carlos's father, and before that the head of everything this house represented, had been shot dead in the same ambush that left Carlos in a wheelchair.
that the men who did it had never been found, that the entire empire had been holding its breath since, waiting to see if the sun would rise or if the whole thing would collapse into pieces other men could pick up. Aaliyah told herself none of that was her business. She was there to do a job, check vitals, manage medication, push him through the exercises he hated, document his slow, frustrating, non-existent progress. She told herself this every single night in her car in the driveway before she drove home, the way another woman might tell herself she wasn't hungry standing in front of a bakery window. It was on the 15th night, close to midnight, that she found him on the floor of his bedroom, having tried and failed to pull himself from his wheelchair to his bed alone, too proud to call for Mateo, too stubborn to press the emergency button clipped to his blanket. "Don't," he said, when she moved to help him, his voice raw in a way she had never heard from him. "Don't look at me like this. I'm not looking at you like anything. I'm looking at you like a patient who needs to get off a marble floor before he gives himself pneumonia. I don't want your pity, Aaliyah." "Good," she said, crouching down, sliding one arm under his shoulders with the ease of 8 years of practice. "Because I don't have any to give you. I have a job to do. Now help me or don't, but either way you're getting off this floor." He was heavier than he looked, all muscle gone tense with humiliation, and for a moment as she hauled him up, his face came dangerously close to hers, close enough that she could see the exact ring of gold hidden in the dark brown of his eyes, close enough to feel his breath catch against her cheek. "Why are you not afraid of me?" he asked, quiet now, none of the ice from their first meeting left in his voice. "Aaliyah, Aaliyah wrapped the cuff around his arm, her fingers brushing skin that was warmer than she expected for a man who kept his whole world so cold. She did not know yet that this was the exact moment Carlos Vega decided she would not be nurse number 5 who quit. She had no idea he had already decided she would not be allowed to leave at all. Aaliyah settled him onto the edge of the bed, breathing hard from the effort, and looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "Because I've already survived scarier things than a man in a wheelchair who's too stubborn to ask for help," she said. "You don't scare me, Carlos. You just make me tired." She saw something crack behind his eyes, something old and buried, something that looked almost like relief. He said suddenly, before she could stand up. "I don't—" He stopped, jaw tightening like the words cost him something physical to say. "I don't sleep well in this house. Sometimes it helps to not be alone with it." Aaliyah should have said no. Every professional instinct in her told her to say no. She sat back down on the edge of his bed instead, and neither of them said another word for a long time. And somewhere in that silence, something between them shifted that neither of them was ready to name. That same night, long after she should have gone home, Aaliyah woke him from a nightmare she never asked about, and he never explained. Not with words, anyway. She heard it through the wall first, a sound like a man drowning in air, sheets twisted around legs that could not run from whatever his mind kept sending him back to. When she pushed open his door, he was soaked in sweat, gripping the headboard, saying a name over and over that wasn't hers.
Papa, muévete, muévete. Carlos. She crossed the room fast, hands finding his shoulders, grounding him the way she'd grounded 100 trauma patients before him, except this time, her own heart was hammering just as hard. "Carlos, you're here. You're safe. Open your eyes." His eyes snapped open, wild, unseeing for one terrible second before they found her face, and the panic in them slowly, painfully, began to drain out. "I was on the roof again," he said, his voice wrecked. "I keep going back to the roof. My father is 3 feet away from me, and I cannot move. I cannot warn him. I cannot do anything but watch the man behind him raise the gun every single night, the exact same 3 seconds, over and over." "You don't have to tell me the rest," Aaliyah said softly, sitting beside him, her hand finding his in the dark. "I want to," Carlos said, and that surprised her more than anything he'd said since she'd arrived. "I have never told anyone the rest. Not Isabella, not Mateo. I told the doctors only what my body did. I never told anyone what happened before it." So she stayed, and he talked, haltingly, in fragments, about the rooftop restaurant in Cartagena where his father used to take business meetings because he liked the wind up there, liked being able to see everyone coming. About the man in the gray jacket who had been introduced as a shipping partner and had instead put 2 bullets into Esteban Vega before anyone in Carlos's detail could draw a weapon. About the 3rd bullet, the one meant to finish Carlos too, that had instead lodged against his spine and left him alive to watch his father die on the concrete in front of him, unable to crawl the 3 feet between them. "I have replayed those 3 feet every night for 6 months, Carlos said. "Sometimes I make it. In the dream, sometimes my legs work and I reach him in time and none of this happens.
And then I wake up, and I am still exactly as useless as I was on that roof. You are not useless, Aaliyah said fiercely, tightening her grip on his hand. A bullet in your spine didn't make you useless, Carlos. It made you injured. Those are two very different words, and I need you to stop confusing them. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. You say things to me no one else in this house has the courage to say. That's because everyone else in this house is afraid of losing their job. I'm only afraid of watching you give up on yourself. She squeezed his hand once, then stood, because staying any longer felt like standing too close to a fire she wasn't ready to be burned by. Get some sleep, Carlos. Tomorrow we're doing the leg lifts whether you like it or not. He almost laughed, a small, broken, real sound. You are relentless. You have no idea, she said, and left him with the ghost of a smile on his face for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. The next morning, everything changed, because Isabella Vega was waiting for Aaliyah in the kitchen with her arms crossed and fire in her eyes. I saw you, Isabella said. No greeting, no warm-up. I was doing my job. Your job is to check his blood pressure, not to sit on his bed at midnight like a... Isabella stopped herself, but the word hung in the air anyway, ugly and unspoken. Like a what, Isabella? Like someone who forgets what she is. Isabella's voice dropped, low and vicious. You are staff. You are paid help. My brother is grieving our father. He is trapped in a chair he hates, and he is vulnerable in ways you cannot understand. Do not mistake his loneliness for something it is not. Aaliyah set down the coffee cup in her hand with deliberate care, because if she didn't, she was fairly certain she would throw it. I'm not mistaking anything. I helped a man off the floor so he wouldn't get sick. That's the whole story. That is never the whole story in this house. Isabella's eyes glittered, sharp and knowing. You do not understand what you have walked into, Miss Miller. My brother does not fall for women. He uses them or he ignores them, and either way they leave broken and paid off. I am telling you this because I do not want to watch it happen to you too. For one unsettling second, Aaliyah almost believed there was real concern buried under Isabella's hostility. Almost. Noted, Aaliyah said, picking her coffee back up. Anything else? Isabella's mouth thinned into something that wasn't quite a smile. Yes, Raphael wants to see you, this afternoon. Alone. A cold thread wound through Aaliyah's stomach. Why? Because my uncle likes to know exactly who is standing close to my brother, Isabella said, already turning to leave. She left the words hanging in the kitchen like smoke and walked out without looking back, leaving Aaliyah standing there with a coffee cup in her hand and a chill crawling up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Rafael Vega received her in a study lined with books Aaliyah suspected he had never read, sitting behind a desk of dark wood with his hands folded like a man posing for a portrait. Sit, please, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, his smile warm in a way that did not match the calculation in his eyes. You have made quite an impression on my nephew, Miss Miller. I'm doing my job, Mr. Vega. Raphael, please. And I have no doubt you are excellent at your job. He leaned back, studying her the way Carlos had that very first day, but where Carlos's gaze felt like a puzzle being solved, Raphael's felt like a knife being sharpened. Tell me, what do you know about this family? Nothing. I know Carlos was hurt. I know he needs care, and that's all I need to know to do my work. A wise answer. Raphael's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. But let me offer you some wisdom of my own, since you seem like a smart woman, and smart women deserve honesty. 6 months ago, my brother, Carlos's father, was murdered. Carlos was shot in the same attack and has not walked since. The men responsible were never found. Do you understand what that means, Miss Miller? That someone in your world is dangerous. It means, Raphael said, leaning forward, that someone very close to this family, perhaps even inside these walls, wanted Esteban Vega dead and wanted Carlos gone or broken enough not to matter. And when a stranger arrives in this house and gets suspiciously close to my nephew in a matter of weeks, he let the sentence trail off, watching her face for a reaction. Aaliyah's heart pounded, but she kept her voice level. Are you accusing me of something? I am simply saying, Raphael said softly, that I will be watching you very, very closely, Miss Miller, for Carlos's sake. I would hate for anything unfortunate to happen to a woman so dedicated to her patient. It was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was a promise wrapped in silk, and Aaliyah felt it settle into her bones as she left that study with her hands trembling and her mind spinning through everything Raphael had just told her. Someone in this house had tried to kill Carlos once already, and Raphael Vega had just made it very clear that he considered her a suspect, or wanted her to believe he did, for reasons she couldn't yet untangle.
She had no idea, walking down that dark marble hallway, that the real danger in that house had a much more familiar face than she could have imagined. She almost quit that night. She sat in her car in the estate's driveway, with her phone in her lap, Diane's number pulled up on the screen, her thumb hovering over the call button for a full 5 minutes, while the Florida heat pressed against the windshield like a hand. Raphael's voice kept looping in her head. I would hate for anything unfortunate to happen to a woman so dedicated to her patient. And every instinct she had built over 8 years of reading dangerous rooms was screaming at her to walk away while she still could. She thought about her mother, who had worked 3 jobs and never once complained where Aaliyah or Tyler could hear it, who had told her, more times than Aaliyah could count, that dignity wasn't about the size of the house you lived in or the car you drove. It was about never letting anyone make you feel small enough to disappear. She thought about the trailer they'd lived in until she was 14, the winter the heat had gone out for 11 days and she'd slept in her coat, the way kids at school used to whisper trailer trash loud enough for her to hear, and she had learned early to lift her chin instead of lowering her eyes. She thought about Tyler, sound asleep 4 states away in a dorm room she was paying for, 1 semester closer to a future their mother never got to see either of her children reach. And she thought about Carlos, sweat-soaked and shaking in her arms at midnight, telling her about 3 feet of concrete he couldn't crawl across to save his father, telling her she said things no one else in that house had the courage to say. She put the phone down without calling Diane. Instead, she called Tyler. "Hey, stranger," he said, groggy, clearly half asleep. "You okay? It's like 11. "I'm fine," Aaliyah said, and made herself believe it as she said it. "Just wanted to hear your voice. How's school?" "Good, great, actually. Turned in that paper I was freaking out about." A pause, the particular pause of a 19-year-old deciding whether to ask a real question. "You sound weird. Is the new job okay? You never tell me anything about it." "It's complicated," she admitted. "The people are complicated. But it's paying for your tuition, so I'm going to stick it out. You don't have to do that for me, you know. Mom didn't work herself to death so you could do the same thing to yourself." The words landed harder than Tyler could have known, and Aaliyah pressed her fingers to her eyes, willing herself not to cry in a driveway with a guard 50 feet away watching her through a rearview mirror. "I'm not working myself to death, Ty. I'm just figuring something out. Something bigger than the job, maybe." "That sounds ominous." "It's not," she said, and laughed despite herself. "Go back to sleep. I love you. Call me if you need anything." "Love you too, weirdo." She sat in the dark a while longer after the call ended, and then, instead of driving home, she found herself walking back through the gate, past the guard with the scarred eyebrow who raised his eyebrows at her but said nothing, back down the long marble hallway to the room where a light was still burning under the door. Carlos looked up when she walked in, surprise flickering across his face. "You left hours ago." "I came back," Aaliyah said simply. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly, not from your uncle, not from anyone else in this house. I have never spoken to anyone named Ochoa. I don't know what your family's business really is, and most days I don't want to know. But I am not a spy, Carlos, and I am not going anywhere just because your uncle looked at me like I was a problem to be solved." Something in Carlos's shoulders eased, a tension she hadn't fully registered until it left him. "I did not think you were," he said quietly, "but I am glad you came back to tell me anyway." "Why?" "Because it means you are choosing to be here, and not simply staying because you have not yet found a reason to leave. Those are very different things, Aaliyah Miller." She didn't have an answer for that, not one she was ready to say out loud yet, so she simply nodded, checked his pulse out of old habit more than necessity, and stayed another hour longer than her shift required, neither of them commenting on it once. She didn't tell Carlos about the conversation with Raphael, not that day, not the day after. She told herself it wasn't relevant to his recovery, that it would only agitate a man whose blood pressure she was actively trying to lower. She told herself a lot of things that week, mostly to avoid admitting the truth. She was starting to care what happened to Carlos Vega far more than a nurse should care about any patient, and that terrified her more than Raphael's veiled threats ever could. Physical therapy became the axis their days turned around. She pushed him through exercises designed to wake nerves the doctors weren't sure were still alive, and Carlos, despite every ounce of pride screaming at him to quit, kept showing up, kept trying,
kept failing in front of her without the humiliation curdling into cruelty the way it had with the nurses before her. Again, he would say through gritted teeth, sweat soaking through his shirt, legs refusing to answer him, and Aaliyah would say again right back, and something about doing it together made the impossible feel slightly less impossible. One evening, 3 weeks in, she caught him watching old home videos on his phone, grainy footage of a much younger Carlos, maybe 8 years old, running across a beach in Cartagena, while a man's laugh echoed behind the camera.
"My father," Carlos said, before she could ask, his voice rough. He used to say, "A man who cannot run toward the people he loves is not a man worth loving." He said it as a joke. I don't think it was a joke. "Your father sounds complicated. He was a monster to his enemies," Carlos said simply, "and the best father I have ever heard of to me." Both things were true. I used to think I would grow up and only be the first part. I am starting to think I might only manage the second. Why do you say that? His eyes met hers, dark and unguarded in a way she had never seen from him. Because since the shooting, I have not been able to protect anyone. Not my sister, not this family, not myself. I sit in this chair and I feel every single day like the world is moving without me, and everyone I love is standing in the path of something I cannot stop because I cannot even stand. You're standing right now, Aaliyah said softly, in the only way that matters. You're still here, still fighting, still trying every single day, even when it would be easier to give up. That's not nothing, Carlos. That's not weak. That's the opposite of weak. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You are the only person in this house who talks to me like I am still a man, he said finally, and not just the seat my father used to sit in. Aaliyah felt her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with professional distance and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, like she had handed him something he thought he'd lost forever. She should have stood up. She should have changed the subject, checked his vitals, done anything to put a wall back between them. Instead, she reached over and took his hand, and neither of them pulled away. And outside the window, the ocean kept moving in and out, like it had all the time in the world, while inside that room, something between them tipped past the point of no return. Neither of them saw Isabella standing in the hallway, watching through the crack in the door, her face unreadable in the dark. But Carlos Vega had spent his whole life learning that softness was a door enemies walked through. And the very next morning, he shut that door so hard, Aaliyah felt it slam across the room the second she walked in. "We will keep this professional from now on," he said, before she had even set her bag down, his voice flat and formal in a way that made her chest ache, like she'd been slapped. "I apologize if I gave you the impression of something else last night. It will not happen again." "Okay," Aaliyah said carefully, watching him refuse to meet her eyes. "Can I ask why?" "You do not need a reason. I am your employer. That should be reason enough." "It's not actually," she said, setting her bag down anyway, refusing to let him see how much the coldness cost her. 12 hours ago, you told me I was the only person in this house who talked to you like you were still a man. Now I'm staff again. Which one is true, Carlos?" His jaw tightened, and for a second she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Both," he said finally. "That is what makes it complicated. Every person who has ever gotten close to me in this life has either been used against me or has used me first. My father taught me that love in this world is a weapon someone else eventually learns to point at your throat. I cannot afford to hand you that weapon, Aaliyah, not when everything I have left is already so fragile. So instead, you'd rather push me away and be lonely and safe," Aaliyah said, "than risk being happy and hurt." "Yes," Carlos said, with a bluntness that startled them both. "That is exactly what I would rather do." Aaliyah felt something hot rise behind her ribs, not quite anger, something closer to grief for a man who had clearly never once been allowed to simply want something without calculating the cost of it first. "Fine," she said quietly. "Professional it is then. Give me your arm, Mr. Vega. I need your blood pressure." She called him Mr. Vega for 6 straight days after that, and he let her. And the silence between them during physical therapy grew so thick it felt like a third person in the room, until the morning the black car rolled up the gravel drive and shattered whatever fragile piece either of them had been pretending to build. 2 days later, everything Aaliyah thought she understood about the house turned upside down.
because a black car pulled up the gravel drive carrying a woman Aaliyah had never seen before. Tall, elegant, dressed like she had stepped out of a magazine, with a smile aimed directly at Carlos, like she owned every inch of him.
"Carlitos," the woman said, sweeping into the room without knocking, without waiting to be announced, kissing both his cheeks like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Look at you, still handsome even sitting down. I told my father the injury wouldn't touch your face, at least." Carlos's whole posture changed, shoulders squaring, jaw tightening, the openness Aaliyah had seen just 2 nights before folding itself back into something guarded and formal. "Valentina," he said, "I wasn't told you were coming." "Your uncle invited me." Valentina's eyes finally slid to Aaliyah, sweeping over her scrubs with the same top-to-bottom assessment Mateo had given her the first day, except there was nothing respectful in it. "And who is this?" "My nurse," Carlos said, "Aaliyah Miller." "How sweet," Valentina said, in a tone that suggested the exact opposite. "Carlitos, could you give us a moment? I need to speak with your nurse about scheduling, boring things." Carlos hesitated, glancing at Aaliyah with something that looked almost like an apology, before Mateo wheeled him toward the door at Valentina's pointed silence. The second they were alone, Valentina's smile vanished like it had never existed. "Let me explain something to you," Valentina said, crossing her arms, "because I don't think anyone in this house has bothered to. Carlos and I have been promised to each other since we were children. Our fathers built an alliance on that promise, an alliance that keeps 2 cartels from going to war with each other. Do you understand what that means?" "I understand you're telling me to back off," Aaliyah said flatly. "I'm telling you that whatever you think is happening between you and Carlos Vega is a fantasy that will get you hurt, or worse, get you killed," Valentina said, her voice dropping to something cold and precise. "This is not a love story, Miss Miller. This is business wearing the face of romance. Carlos will marry me before the year is over, because if he doesn't, men will die, including possibly him. So enjoy your paycheck and remember your place." She left the room with the same sweeping confidence she'd entered with, and Aaliyah stood there alone, her heart hammering, the word marry echoing through her skull like a gunshot. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that falling for a man like Carlos Vega was reckless. She had not known it would come with a fiancé attached. She had no idea that Valentina's visit that day was not a coincidence at all, that somebody inside that house had made a phone call the week before, deliberately, to bring her here at exactly this moment. Valentina did not leave that week. She stayed, installed in a guest suite down the hall like she already owned it, and every evening a formal dinner was held in the great dining room that Aaliyah, a staff, had no real reason to attend, except Carlos insisted every single night that she be there. "She is a guest," Isabella muttered to Aaliyah on the 3rd night, watching Valentina laugh too loudly at something Raphael said, her hand resting on Carlos's forearm like it belonged there. "You are a nurse who happens to also sit at our table now. Do you understand how strange that looks to everyone in this house?" "I didn't ask to be here," Aaliyah said, watching Valentina's manicured fingers trail along Carlos's sleeve. "Your brother insists." "I know," Isabella said, and for once there was no accusation in it, only something like pity. "That's what worries me." Aaliyah watched Carlos endure Valentina's attention with the same careful stillness he'd shown their very first meeting, polite, distant, giving nothing away, and told herself it shouldn't matter, that a week of cold Mr. Vegas between them and she had no claim on what his face did or didn't do around another woman. She told herself that all the way through the soup course, through the 2nd course, right up until Valentina rose from her chair with a bright, deliberate smile and asked Carlos to dance to the quiet music drifting in from the terrace speakers. "I don't dance anymore, Valentina. You know this." "Nonsense. I heard a rumor you stood on your own 2 feet last week, just for a moment, during therapy." Valentina's eyes flicked sharp and knowing to Aaliyah. "Your nurse must be a miracle worker. Surely you can manage a slow song for your future wife." The words "future wife" landed in the room like a dropped glass, and Aaliyah kept her face perfectly still through sheer force of will, cutting her food into smaller and smaller pieces she had no intention of eating.
Carlos did not dance. He said something quiet and final to Valentina that made her smile falter for just a second before she recovered it, laughing it off as though she had only been teasing, and the dinner continued as if nothing had happened at all.
But later, when Aaliyah excused herself early, claiming a headache that was only half a lie, she found Carlos waiting for her in the hallway outside the dining room, his wheelchair angled to block her path. "You are angry," he said. "I'm tired, Mr. Vega," Aaliyah said, using the name deliberately, watching it land exactly the way she meant it to. "Do not call me that," Carlos said, an edge of something desperate breaking through his careful control. "Not you. Anyone else in this house, I do not care, but not you." "Then stop treating me like I'm interchangeable with whoever you happen to be seated next to at dinner," Aaliyah snapped, the week of swallowed frustration finally breaking loose. "You froze me out for 6 days, Carlos, told me to my face you'd rather be lonely than risk anything with me, and then the second Valentina shows up talking about future wife, you want me sitting right there at your table watching it happen. What exactly am I supposed to be to you?" Carlos's jaw worked, his hands tightening on the wheels of his chair. "I do not know," he admitted, quieter now. "I only know that watching you leave that room tonight felt worse than anything Valentina said. I know that is not fair to ask of you. I am asking it anyway, because I am apparently not as strong as I like to believe." Aaliyah stood there a long moment, torn between the urge to walk away and the ache in her chest that refused to let her. "You don't get to have it both ways, Carlos," she said finally, softer now. "Cold when it's safe, close when it's not. Figure out which one you actually want. I'll be here when you do, but I won't keep bleeding for a man who won't decide." She left him there in the hallway and did not look back to see the look on his face, though she would learn much later that Mateo had watched the entire exchange from the shadows and had gone that very night straight to Isabella to say he thought, for the first time since Esteban Vega's death, that Carlos finally had something worth fighting to keep. Aaliyah didn't confront Carlos that night. She told herself it wasn't her business, that whatever arrangement existed between him and Valentina existed long before she'd walked into that house, that she had no claim to a man who wasn't hers to claim. She went through the motions of her job with a professionalism so brittle it felt like it might shatter, and Carlos, watching her, seemed to know exactly what had happened in that room, even though neither of them said Valentina's name. "You are angry with me," he said, 3 days later, during a therapy session that had gone unusually silent. "I'm not anything with you. You don't owe me explanations, Carlos. We work together. That's all this is." "That is a lie," he said quietly, "and we both know it." Aaliyah stopped adjusting the resistance band around his ankle and looked up at him, something hot and honest finally breaking through the professional wall she'd been building for 3 days straight. "Fine. You want honesty? I don't understand you. One night you're holding my hand like I'm the only person in this house who sees you as human, and 3 days later I find out you're engaged to a woman who talks to me like I'm something she scraped off her shoe. So forgive me if I don't know which version of you I'm supposed to trust." "It is not an engagement," Carlos said, his voice tight. "It is an arrangement my father made before he died. A political marriage to end a war between 2 families that has already cost too many lives. I never agreed to love her. I agreed to survive. And where does that leave me?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded, and Carlos's jaw worked like he was fighting something down. "I do not know," he admitted, and it was the most honest thing he had said to her since the day they met. "I have not known what to do with you since the moment you walked into this room and told me you were not afraid of me. I have spent my whole life being told what I owe this family, this business, my father's memory. I have never once been asked what I want." His eyes lifted to hers, dark and burning. "I think, Aaliyah Miller, that what I want is you, and I think that terrifies me more than anything Raphael or Valentina or any enemy of this family could ever do to me." Aaliyah's breath caught somewhere in her throat. Before she could answer, before either of them could close the distance that had been building between them for weeks, the door burst open, and Mateo stood there, pale, breathless,
a look on his face that made Aaliyah's blood run cold. "Carlos," he said, "we have a problem. Raphael just called an emergency meeting of the whole family. He says he has proof someone inside this house has been feeding information to the Ochoa cartel, the same men who ambushed you and killed your father." Carlos's whole body went rigid. "Proof? What proof?" Mateo's eyes flicked, just for a second, to Aaliyah, and something in that half-second glance made her stomach drop through the floor. And then it hit her, cold and sudden, like a bucket of ice water down her spine. Tyler, her brother, had been in debt, real debt, the dangerous kind, the kind that came from a bad investment app and a worse decision to borrow from a man at his college who promised fast money and delivered threats instead. Tyler had sworn to her, sworn on their mother's grave, that he'd paid it off months ago using money he said he'd saved from a part-time job. She had believed him because she needed to believe him, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. What if he hadn't paid it off? What if the man he owed money to had a name, Ochoa, and had used her brother's connection to her and her connection to this house as a way in? She pressed her palms against her eyes and forced herself not to cry, because crying wouldn't fix this, and Mateo's warning echoed in her head from that very first day. Don't cry in front of him. Except this wasn't about Carlos anymore. This was about proving her own family hadn't been used as a weapon without her knowledge, and about the terrifying possibility that it had. The door opened an hour later. It wasn't Mateo. It was Isabella. "I need to talk to you," Isabella said, closing the door behind her, and for the first time since Aaliyah had met her, there was no hostility in her face at all, only fear. "If you're here to accuse me too, I don't think you did it," Isabella said quickly, cutting her off. "That's why I'm here. Raphael's timeline doesn't make sense. He says these phone records go back 6 months, before you ever applied for this job, before the agency even had your resume on file, which means either the records are fabricated or someone is using your name without you knowing." Aaliyah's heart pounded. "Why would you help me? You've hated me since the day I got here." Isabella's jaw tightened. "Because I don't trust Raphael. I never have. He was the last person seen with my father before the ambush. He was supposed to be at that meeting on the rooftop, and he canceled at the last minute, claiming he was sick. And now, 6 months later, the moment my brother starts to trust someone outside this family, someone who isn't controlled by Raphael, someone who might actually convince Carlos to walk away from this life, suddenly Raphael has evidence against her." Isabella's eyes were hard, sharp, terrified all at once. "I think my uncle killed my father, and I think he's trying to get rid of you before you get close enough to help Carlos see the truth." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Aaliyah gripped the edge of the bed, her mind racing back through every strange interaction. Raphael's veiled threat in the study, his warm smile that never catched his eyes, the way he'd seemed almost eager to plant suspicion around her from the very first week. "We need to tell Carlos. Carlos won't believe either of us without proof," Isabella said grimly. "Raphael has spent 6 months making himself indispensable, playing the grieving brother, the loyal advisor. My brother trusts him because he has no reason not to. We need something real, and I think," Isabella said, lowering her voice, "I know where to find it."
What Isabella led her to, deep in a locked office in the estate's east wing that Raphael believed no one else had access to, was a laptop with financial records spanning 3 years, records showing wire transfers between one of Raphael's shell companies and an account registered to a man named Diego Ochoa, records showing a payment made 2 days before Esteban Vega's murder, records showing, buried in an email thread Isabella's shaking hands nearly missed, a message from Raphael to Diego Ochoa that read simply, "The rooftop meeting is confirmed. He will be there at 9. His son will be with him. Do what needs to be done." Aaliyah felt sick reading it. Raphael hadn't just allowed the ambush that killed Esteban and paralyzed Carlos. He had planned it. "We need to get this to Carlos immediately," Aaliyah said, her hands trembling as she copied the files onto a flash drive. "There's something else," Isabella said quietly, scrolling further down the folder, her face draining of color. "Look at this. A message from 3 days ago." She turned the screen toward Aaliyah, and the words on it made her blood turn to ice. "The nurse is a problem. She is getting too close to him. If she convinces him to distrust me before the transfer of power is finalized, everything falls apart. Handle her the way we discussed. Make it look like the Ochoa connection. Make it look like her fault. He's been planning to frame me since before I even knew Valentina existed," Aaliyah whispered. "Not just frame you," Isabella said, her voice shaking now too. "Look at the last line." Aaliyah's eyes dropped to the final sentence of the message, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "If framing her is not enough to remove her permanently from the situation, we will need a more final solution before the wedding." Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed, and both women froze. "Someone's coming," Isabella whispered. They barely made it out of the office before footsteps echoed in the hallway. Raphael's footsteps, unhurried,
confident, a man who believed himself untouchable in his own house. Isabella shoved the laptop closed and pulled Aaliyah into a side corridor, both of them pressed against the wall, holding their breath as Raphael passed within 10 feet of where they hid, humming softly to himself like a man without a single thing on his conscience. "We need Mateo," Isabella breathed once he was gone. "He's the only one Carlos trusts completely besides me. If we bring him the flash drive." "And if Mateo is working for Raphael too?" Aaliyah asked, her whole body still shaking with adrenaline. "We don't know who else is involved." Isabella's face went pale, because they both knew it was a real possibility, and neither of them had any way to be sure. "There's a way to find out," Isabella said slowly. "Mateo has worked for this family since before I was born. My father trusted him with everything, including once a piece of information he never trusted to anyone else, a location, a safe house, off the books, that only 3 people were ever supposed to know existed. My father, Mateo, and Carlos. If Mateo is loyal, he'll recognize it the second I say it out loud. If he's working for Raphael, he'll have no idea what I'm talking about, because Raphael was deliberately kept out of that circle." They found Mateo 2 corridors later, checking a side entrance with the tight, controlled urgency of a man who already suspected something in the house had gone badly wrong. "Casablanca," Isabella said to him, without preamble, watching his face like it was the only truth left she had access to. "Does that mean anything to you?" Something shifted behind Mateo's eyes, recognition, sharp and immediate, followed by a wariness that told Aaliyah he understood exactly why she was asking. "Your father's safe house outside Barranquilla," he said quietly. "Nobody outside this family was ever supposed to know that name. Why are you asking me this in a hallway with dust in your hair, Isabella?"
Isabella exhaled, relief loosening something in her shoulders. "Because I needed to know I could trust you before I told you what we found." It took less than 4 minutes to explain, and Mateo's face went through disbelief, then fury, then a cold, focused calm that Aaliyah recognized from soldiers she treated once, years ago, in an ER close enough to a base to see it often. The specific stillness of a man deciding exactly what he was about to do and how far he was willing to go to do it. "I have suspected Raphael for months," Mateo admitted, low and grim. "Small things. Guards on his personal payroll who report to him and not to Carlos. Meetings he never logs. I had no proof, only instinct. And instinct does not move against a man like Rafael Vega without something solid behind it." His eyes hardened on the flash drive in Isabella's hand. "You have solid now." "We need to get this to Carlos," Aaliyah said again, urgency rising in her chest. "Raphael's men are already searching for you both," Mateo said, "which means we do not have the luxury of walking through the front of this house. There's a service passage." They didn't get the chance to decide. Before they could take another step, 3 of Raphael's men rounded the corner, men Aaliyah recognized from the gate, men who worked security under Raphael's direct command, not Carlos's. "Ms. Miller," the lead guard said, his voice flat, almost bored, like this was routine. "Mr. Vega wants to see you. Both of you, actually." "Now, which Mr. Vega?" Isabella demanded, stepping in front of Aaliyah with a protectiveness that surprised them both. The guard's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "The one who's still in charge of this house's security, Ms. Vega. Your uncle." Mateo, standing half a step behind them, went very still, and in the half-second of confusion as the guards moved to separate the women from him, he slipped backward into the shadow of a side corridor and was gone before anyone thought to stop him, the flash drive's contents already sent, silently, from his phone to 2 men he trusted with his life. They were escorted, not gently, down to the same study where Raphael had first delivered his veiled threat to Aaliyah weeks ago. Raphael sat behind his desk exactly as he had that first day, hands folded, smile warm and empty. "Isabella," he said pleasantly, "I was told you've been in my office. That's very unlike you, mija." "I know what you did," Isabella said, her voice trembling with fury now instead of fear. "I have proof, Raphael. Emails, wire transfers, everything." Something in Raphael's face went perfectly still, the warmth draining out of it like water through a cracked glass. "That's a very serious accusation, Isabella. I would think carefully about who you repeat it to." "I'm going to show it to Carlos." Raphael's eyes slid, slow and deliberate, to Aaliyah, and the smile that spread across his face made her stomach drop through the floor. "I don't think that will be a problem,"
he said softly, because Carlos already believes Ms. Miller here sold his father out to the Ochoa cartel. Whatever proof you think you have found here, it will simply look like a nurse and a grieving daughter, desperate and confused, trying to shift the blame at the last minute. Very sad, really. He rose slowly from his desk, buttoning his jacket with the calm of a man who had already won. Take them both to the East Wing. Lock the door. I'll handle Carlos myself. You won't get away with this, Aaliyah said, her voice shaking but steady. Raphael paused at the door, looking back at her with something almost like amusement. Ms. Miller, I have been getting away with things since before you were born. Did you truly believe a nurse and a grieving daughter were going to stop me?
The door closed behind him with a heavy, final click, and Aaliyah heard the lock turn from the outside, sealing them both into a room with no windows and no way out, while somewhere else in that enormous house, Rafael Vega walked toward Carlos with a lie already forming on his lips. Carlos was in his room, staring at the ocean through the 2-inch gap in his curtains, when Rafael found him, and for the first time since the shooting, something in Carlos's chest had gone quiet and cold in a way that had nothing to do with his legs. Tio, he said, without turning, tell me it isn't true. Tell me she isn't what your evidence says she is. Rafael's face arranged itself into careful sorrow. I wish I could, mijo. I liked her too, in the beginning, but the records don't lie. 6 months of contact with the Ochoa family, starting before your father died. I believe she was placed here deliberately. I believe she was meant to finish what the ambush started, to get close to you, to learn everything about this family's operations, our security, our weaknesses. I believe, Carlos, that if she has not already reported everything she knows back to them, she will very soon. Carlos's hands curled into fists on the arms of his wheelchair. Where is she? Secured, safe. I would never harm her without your authorization. I know what she has come to mean to you, and despite everything, I respect that. Rafael's voice softened, dripping with false compassion. But Carlos, you must think clearly now. Isabella is defending her, claims she found evidence against me of all people, evidence I suspect Miss Miller planted to protect herself when she realized we were closing in. Your sister is young, trusting, easily manipulated by a woman clever enough to make a paralyzed man fall in love with her in 3 weeks. Every word was a scalpel, cutting precisely, and Carlos felt something in his chest tear open, not just suspicion, but grief, a grief so total it felt like his father dying all over again. I want to see her, Carlos said. I want to hear it from her. Of course, Rafael said smoothly, but Carlos, be careful. She is very convincing. That is exactly what makes her dangerous. He left Carlos alone with those words ringing in the silence, and Carlos sat by the window with his fists clenched and his heart in pieces, staring at the ocean and trying to decide whether the last 3 weeks of his life had been the first real thing he'd felt since his father died, or the most elaborate lie anyone had ever told him. He did not yet know that the answer was standing 3 floors away, locked in a room, running out of time. In the East Wing, Aaliyah paced the length of the small room, while Isabella sat on the floor with her back against the wall, the flash drive clutched in her fist like it was the only solid thing left in her world. He's going to twist everything, Isabella said, her voice hollow. By the time Carlos hears any version of the truth, it will already be poisoned. That's what my uncle does. He doesn't lie outright. He just makes the truth sound impossible. Then we find a way to show Carlos the proof directly, Aaliyah said. Not through Rafael, not through anyone Rafael controls. How? We're locked in a room with no windows, Aaliyah. Aaliyah's eyes swept the space again, searching for anything, a vent, a weak point in the doorframe, anything. And that's when she saw it, a small, old service door in the corner, half hidden behind a decorative cabinet, the kind of forgotten passage old estates were full of, meant for servants generations ago to move unseen through the house. Does that go anywhere? Aaliyah asked, already moving toward it. Isabella's eyes widened. It used to connect to the old kitchen pantry. I haven't used it since I was a child, hiding from my father's business meetings. It might still be open. It was stiff, swollen with disuse, but it gave way under their combined weight, opening into a narrow, dusty passage that smelled of old wood and forgotten decades.
They moved through it quickly, quietly, Isabella leading the way through a memory she hadn't touched in 15 years, until they emerged, dust-covered and breathless, into the pantry behind the kitchen, free and closer to Carlos's room than either of them had dared hope.
"We don't have much time," Isabella whispered. "Once Raphael realizes we're gone." They didn't finish the sentence. They ran. Carlos was still at the window when the door to his room burst open. Not Raphael this time, but Aaliyah, disheveled, dust in her hair, eyes blazing with a fury and a fear he had never seen from her before, Isabella right behind her, clutching something in her fist. "Carlos," Aaliyah said, breathless, "I need you to listen to me for exactly 2 minutes before you decide anything." "Guards told me you were secured," Carlos said slowly, his voice carefully flat, giving nothing away. "Your uncle secured us because we found proof he murdered your father," Isabella said, crossing the room and shoving the laptop she'd grabbed on the way out under the table in front of him, plugging in the flash drive with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "It's all here, Carlos. Wire transfers to Diego Ochoa, an email confirming the rooftop meeting, confirming you would be there with Papa, and a message from 3 days ago about Aaliyah, about making it, quote, look like her fault, so he could get rid of her before she got close enough to make you doubt him." Carlos stared at the screen as the files loaded, his face unreadable, and Aaliyah watched him read the words that would either save her or destroy everything, her heart pounding so loud she was certain he could hear it across the room. "The rooftop meeting is confirmed. He will be there at 9. His son will be with him. Do what needs to be done." Carlos's hand, resting on the arm of his wheelchair, began to shake. "This could be fabricated," he said, but his voice had lost all its earlier certainty. "Anyone could have written this." "Read the next one," Isabella said quietly. "The one about the wedding and the transfer of power and what he plans to do to consolidate control once Valentina's family is locked into the alliance, and you are," his words, Carlos, "no longer a complication." Carlos scrolled down, and Aaliyah watched the exact moment his face changed, watched 6 months of grief and suspicion and carefully buried rage rise up all at once as he read his uncle's plan laid bare in black and white, not just his father's murder, but his own, timed for some time after the wedding, once Raphael no longer needed him as a figurehead. "He was going to kill me too," Carlos said, so quietly it was almost a whisper. "After the wedding, once the alliance was secure, and I was no longer useful." "Carlos," Aaliyah crossed the room and knelt in front of his wheelchair, taking his shaking hands in hers. "I need you to know I never contacted anyone named Ochoa in my life. Whatever record Raphael showed you, it was planted, the same way everything else has been planted, to control you, to isolate you, to make sure the only voice you trusted was his." Carlos looked at her, and for a long, aching moment, she saw every version of him at once. The cold, guarded man from their first meeting, the vulnerable man on the bedroom floor, the man who had told her 3 days ago that she terrified him more than any enemy, and all of it collapsed into a single, raw expression of grief and fury, and something that looked, unmistakably, like love. "I believed him," Carlos said, his voice breaking. "For 1 hour I believed him over you. You had proof in front of you and a family you trusted telling you it was real," Isabella said gently. "That's not a betrayal, Carlos. That's being human." Before Carlos could answer, the door slammed open, and Raphael stood in the frame, flanked by 4 of his men, his warm mask finally completely gone, replaced by something cold and furious and dangerous. "I see the little birds escaped their cage," Raphael said softly. "Clever. I underestimated you both. That won't happen again."
"It's over, Raphael," Carlos said, his voice low and lethal in a way Aaliyah had never heard before. "I know everything. I know about my father. I know what you had planned for the wedding. I know what you had planned for me." Raphael's expression didn't crack. If anything, it hardened into something colder, more honest than Aaliyah had seen from him yet. "You know, but you cannot do anything about it, mijo. Look at yourself. You cannot even stand. Your men outside answer to me now, have for months. Did you truly think loyalty in this family runs to a broken man in a chair? I let you believe you still ran this house because it was useful to keep you calm, keep you cooperating, until the wedding secured everything permanently. But since we're being honest with each other now," Raphael's hand moved to his jacket, and the click of a gun being drawn echoed through the room like a thunderclap. "I think it's time to stop pretending." Isabella gasped, stepping backward, and Aaliyah's whole body went rigid, every nurse's instinct in her screaming to get between the gun and the man she loved, even though every rational thought told her it would do nothing at all. "You would kill your own family," Carlos said, "in front of witnesses, in this house, And think you would survive what comes after? I have survived worse, Raphael said, and there will be no witnesses left to speak of it. He raised the gun, aimed not at Carlos, but at Aaliyah, a calculated cruelty, forcing Carlos to watch the woman he loved die before his own end came. And in that single, frozen, impossible second, something in Carlos Vega broke apart and rebuilt itself entirely at once. He stood up. 6 months of paralysis, 6 months of doctors telling him the nerve damage might be permanent, 6 months of humiliation and rage that had nowhere to go. All of it detonated in a single instant of pure animal desperation as Carlos gripped the arms of his wheelchair and forced his legs, shaking, screaming with pain, to hold his weight for the first time since a bullet had shattered his spine on a rooftop in Cartagena. "Get away from her," he said, his voice cracking the air like a whip, "or I will kill every single one of you in this room." This was the moment, the exact moment that had opened this story, played back now with every piece finally in place. Carlos standing, impossible and furious and terrified, between Aaliyah and a bullet meant to end her life, while Raphael's men froze in shock and Isabella screamed, and the whole house seemed to hold its breath at once. Raphael, for the first time since Aaliyah had met him, looked genuinely afraid. "That's not possible," Raphael breathed. "You're paralyzed," the doctors said. "The doctors were wrong," Carlos said, taking one shaking step forward, then another, agony ridden across every line of his face, but his eyes locked on Raphael with a fury that had 6 months of grief behind it. "Or maybe I just never had a good enough reason to try until now." Mateo appeared in the doorway behind Raphael's men, weapon already drawn, 3 of Carlos' own loyal guards behind him, men who had been quietly gathering intelligence on Raphael's betrayal for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment, a moment Isabella had secretly set in motion the second she found that laptop. "Drop it, Raphael," Mateo said. "It's finished." For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. Then Raphael's gun hand wavered, his eyes darting between Carlos, standing impossible, furious, and the 4 armed men now surrounding him, and something in his face finally completely collapsed. "You would choose her," Raphael said, disbelief and disgust twisting his voice. "Over your own blood, over everything your father built." "My father built a legacy on love and loyalty," Carlos said. "You built yours on murder and lies. I am not choosing her over my blood, Tio. I am choosing what my blood was always supposed to mean before you poisoned it." Raphael's gun clattered to the marble floor a second before Mateo's men reached him, and the sound of it echoed through the room like the final note of a song that had been building towards this exact moment since the story began. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of shouting and movement and the distant wail of sirens that never came, because in a house like this, the police were never the ones called to clean up a mess. Men like Mateo were. Raphael was taken somewhere Aaliyah didn't ask about and didn't want to know, his network of loyal guards disarmed and removed one by one as word spread through the house that the true head of the family was impossibly standing again.
Carlos collapsed almost immediately after Raphael's men were subdued, his legs finally giving out from the impossible strain he'd forced on them, and Aaliyah caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to the floor with hands that had gone from shaking with fear to shaking with something else entirely. "You idiot," she said, half sobbing, half laughing, pressing her forehead against his. "You absolute reckless idiot. You could have torn something. You could have made it permanent." "I would tear every nerve in my body 100 times over," Carlos said, breathless, pale, but smiling in a way she had never once seen from him, "before I would watch him point a gun at you and do nothing." "That's not romantic, Carlos. That's insane." "Then I am an insane man," he said, "who is very much in love with you, Aaliyah Miller. I think I have been since the first day you told me I didn't scare you. I have been trying to build a wall against it ever since, and today you watched me tear the whole thing down in about 4 seconds. Aaliyah laughed, tears streaming down her face, and kissed him right there on the marble floor of a house that had almost buried them both, while Isabella stood in the doorway wiping her own eyes, and Mateo pretended very hard to be busy with something else entirely. It was not, Aaliyah thought later, the way she had ever imagined falling in love would look, but it was, without question,
the realest thing she had ever felt. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about a life connected to a family like the Vegas was ever simple, and Aaliyah understood that more completely now than she had the day she'd first driven up that gravel road, uncertain and underpaid, and desperate to help her brother. Tyler's situation was resolved quietly, cleanly, in a way Aaliyah chose not to look at too closely. The debt he'd hidden from her, the debt that had, in some tangled and coincidental way she never fully understood, made her an easier target for a frame Raphael had already been planning regardless, was simply gone one day, along with a phone call from Tyler in which he cried and apologized and actually promised this time, to never lie to her again. She believed him, mostly because Carlos had made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that nobody in his world lied to Aaliyah Miller and got away with it twice. Valentina did not take the collapse of the arranged marriage well, though it turned out, in a twist that made Isabella laugh out loud for the first time in months, that Valentina had never particularly wanted the marriage either, and was significantly more relieved than insulted once the political necessity behind it evaporated along with Raphael's influence. She left with a parting remark to Aaliyah that was almost, though not quite, a compliment. "You're either very brave or very stupid, Miss Miller. I suppose in this family, those are usually the same thing." Carlos's recovery, once it started, moved faster than any doctor could explain. They spoke in careful medical language about psychogenic overlay, about trauma manifesting physically, about the mind's power to lock the body away when the body has nowhere safe left to stand. But Aaliyah, who had spent every single day of 6 months in that room with him, understood it more simply than any of them. Carlos hadn't just been shot. He had lost his father, lost his sense of who he was supposed to be, lost every certainty he'd built his life on, all in the same violent hour. His legs had simply been carrying a weight far too heavy for nerves and muscle to bear alone. It took him 4 more months of grueling, furious, tearful physical therapy, with Aaliyah beside him for every single one of them, no longer as his nurse, since he had gently, insistently made it clear within 2 weeks of Raphael's arrest that he refused to be her patient any longer, before he walked, unassisted, down the length of that same marble hallway where he had once stood for the first time to save her life. Tyler came to visit 2 months into all of it, nervous in a way Aaliyah had never seen from her usually unshakable little brother, standing at the gate in a shirt he'd clearly ironed for the occasion, staring up at the estate like he'd wandered onto a movie set. "You didn't tell me your new boyfriend lived in a castle," he muttered, as the guard with the scarred eyebrow waved them through. "He's not exactly my boyfriend," Aaliyah said, though the word landed somewhere warm in her chest anyway. "It's complicated, Ty. Everything about this is complicated. You disappear for months, you won't tell me what you actually do here, and now I find out you're dating a guy with armed guards at his front gate. Forgive me for having questions."
But whatever nerves Tyler walked in with dissolved within the hour, because Carlos, cold, guarded Carlos, who had once terrified 4 nurses out of that house in a matter of days, sat with him on the back terrace and asked him with genuine interest about the engineering program he'd just switched into, about the classes that scared him, about what he wanted to build with his life once he got there. Aaliyah watched from the doorway, throat tight, as Carlos listened to her brother the way he listened to no one else in that house except her, fully, without distraction, like the words mattered. "He's intense," Tyler admitted later, in the car on the way back to the airport. "But he looks at you like you hung the moon, Aaliyah. I've never seen anyone look at you like that, not even Marcus, and you thought you were going to marry Marcus." "Marcus left the second things got hard," Aaliyah said quietly. "Carlos ran toward a bullet for me on legs that hadn't worked in 6 months. I think that's a pretty clear difference, Ty." Tyler was quiet for a moment, watching the palm trees blur past the window. "Just be careful. Whatever world that is, it's not the world we grew up in. I don't want you getting hurt because you fell for someone bigger than both of us understand." She didn't have an answer for that either, not when she was ready to say out loud, because some small, honest part of her carried the same fear home with her every single night. That fear found its shape 3 weeks later, on an afternoon that started ordinary and ended with Aaliyah's hands shaking around a phone that would not stop ringing.
It was Mateo who told her first, finding her in the kitchen with a grimness she'd learned to recognize as bad news before he even opened his mouth. Diego Ochoa's brother has been making calls, he said, asking questions about the nurse who was in this house when Raphael's arrangement fell apart, asking where she lives when she isn't here. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. You think he knows I had nothing to do with any of it? I think men like that do not care about the truth, Mateo said grimly. Raphael dead in a cell awaiting trial is not satisfying to a man who wanted to watch this family burn from the inside. He wants someone to blame that he can still reach, and you are the easiest person in Carlos's life to reach because until 3 weeks ago, you drove yourself home every single night in an unguarded car. They told Carlos together, and Aaliyah watched something in his face go dangerously, coldly still. Not the vulnerable stillness of the man who told her about the rooftop in the dark, but something older, harder, a version of him she suspected his father would have recognized instantly. He will not touch you, Carlos said low and absolute. I do not care what it costs. I do not care whose name I have to remind this city of. He will not touch you. Carlos, I'm not asking you to start a war over me. You are not asking, he said, wheeling closer, taking both her hands in his with a grip that trembled slightly, not from weakness this time, but from something fiercer. I am telling you, I have already lost my father to men like this. I have already lost 6 months of my life to a bullet meant to finish what they started. I am not going to lose you too, Aaliyah, because I was too proud or too careful to protect the one thing in this entire ugly world that ever made me want to keep living in it. It took another 2 tense weeks. Security doubled around her apartment, a driver assigned whether she wanted one or not, a quiet, careful negotiation Carlos conducted through channels Aaliyah never asked about and never wanted to, before Mateo came to them both with the news that the threat had been neutralized, the message received, the Ochoa brother persuaded through means Aaliyah chose not to examine too closely that Aaliyah Miller was permanently, absolutely off limits. She hated that a part of her felt relief instead of horror at how it was handled. She was starting to understand that loving a man like Carlos Vega meant lemming to hold 2 truths at once, that the world he came from was capable of terrible things, and that every one of those terrible things, in his hands, had become a wall built entirely around keeping her safe.
I'm not naive, she told him, the night it was finally over, both of them sitting on the same terrace where he'd once told her he wanted a life different from his father's. I know what it costs to make that threat disappear. I know what world I'm choosing if I stay in this with you. I know, Carlos said quietly. I will not pretend otherwise to make it easier for you to choose. I only know that I would rather you choose it with open eyes than lose you to a comfortable lie. Then I'm choosing it, Aaliyah said, and meant it more than she had ever meant anything. Open eyes and all. The empire did not disappear, because empires like the one Esteban Vega built rarely disappear all at once. But it changed, quietly and deliberately, in the months that followed. Carlos began moving parts of the family's wealth into legitimate shipping and real estate ventures, slow and careful, the way a man diffuses something that has been armed for decades. He told Aaliyah one night on the back terrace with the ocean rolling dark and endless in front of them, that he didn't know if he could ever fully walk away from what his father had built. But I know I don't want to build the rest of my life the way he built his, Carlos said. I don't want a wife who is an arrangement. I don't want children raised the way Isabella and I were raised, taught to be afraid of love because love is a weakness men can use against you. I want— He stopped, turning to look at her, the ocean wind pulling at her copper hair, and something in his face went soft in the way it only ever did for her. I want what I found in that room with you. Someone who does not flinch from what I am and does not let me hide from what I could be instead. That sounds like a lot to want from one curvy nurse from a town you'd never heard of 6 months ago, Aaliyah said, smiling despite the tightness in her throat. It is exactly what I want, Carlos said, and then slower, more carefully than she had ever heard him speak, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box, his hand, the same hand that had once gripped a wheelchair hard enough to force his body to stand, trembling now for an entirely different reason. Aaliyah Miller, you walked into the worst year of my life and made me want to survive it. You were not afraid of me when everyone else was. You saw the man underneath everything my family built, and you loved him anyway. I am asking you, not as an arrangement, not as a business,
but as a man finally choosing something for himself for the very first time. Will you marry me? Aaliyah's tears came before her answer did, hot and unstoppable, and she was laughing and crying at the same time when she finally managed to say yes. And Carlos Vega, cold, guarded, once paralyzed Carlos Vega, who had not smiled at anyone in 6 months before she arrived, smiled so wide and so openly that Isabella, watching from the doorway with her own eyes wet, said later it was the first time in her life she had seen her brother look exactly like their father used to in the old home videos, laughing on a beach in Cartagena, before the world got heavy enough to bury it. They were married a year later, on that same stretch of Gulf Coast, under an open sky instead of behind curtained windows, and Aaliyah wore her mother's earrings, and Tyler walked her down an aisle lined with white flowers, and cried more than she did. Isabella stood beside her as her maid of honor, no longer the sharp, suspicious young woman who had warned Aaliyah away in a kitchen 11 months earlier, but a friend, a sister in every way that mattered. Carlos stood at the end of that aisle on his own 2 legs, strong now, whole in a way that had nothing to do with nerves or muscle, and everything to do with a heart that had finally stopped protecting itself from the one thing it needed most. When Aaliyah reached him, he took her hands in his and said, quiet enough that only she could hear it, "You are the only thing I have ever been given in my life that I did not have to fight for, threaten, or inherit. You simply chose me. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." "I already know I won't," Aaliyah said, smiling through tears, "because I've already survived the worst version of loving you, Carlos Vega. Everything after this is just the reward." The ocean rolled in behind them, patient and endless, the way it had rolled in through every dark night and every impossible morning of the year that brought them here. And somewhere in that sound, in that light, in the steady, certain way Carlos held her hand, like he never intended to let it go again, was the answer to every question the story had ever asked. That a man who had lost everything could still learn to stand again, not for revenge, not for power, not even for survival, but for love. And that a woman who had spent her whole life taking care of everyone else had finally, completely found someone who would spend the rest of his life taking care of her right back.